For 3 years, the Alpha King had not touched a single woman. Some believed it was a vow. Others whispered it was a curse. But the oldest servants of Blackthorn Citadel knew a darker truth. Every hand that reached for him had left in tears, while every woman he touched carried away a memory they wished they could forget. The winter wind swept through the towering gates of Blackthorn Citadel, carrying the scent of pine, cold stone, and the distant smoke of thousands of torches already burning long before sunset. Snow clung stubbornly to the ancient walls, painting the fortress in silver beneath a sky the color of fading steel. From every road leading toward the capital, noble carriages rolled one after another, their polished wheels crunching over frozen gravel as banners bearing the crests of powerful wolf packs fluttered proudly in the bitter wind. Tonight was unlike any other. For the first time in 3 long years, the royal palace had opened its gates to every noble family with an unmarried daughter. No invitation had explained why. It didn't need to. Rumors had traveled faster than ravens. The Alpha King would finally appear before the court. The Alpha King who had lived behind closed doors for years. The Alpha King who had never danced, never courted, never allowed any woman within arm's reach since the night the curse descended upon him. Even the marketplace outside the city walls had fallen strangely quiet this morning, every merchant repeating the same story in hushed voices as though speaking too loudly might awaken something ancient beneath the mountain. Inside the palace, servants hurried through endless corridors lined with crimson banners embroidered with silver wolves. Candles flickered beneath vaulted ceilings so high they disappeared into darkness, while polished marble reflected golden light across floors worn smooth by centuries of kings. Yet among the dozens of servants rushing from one chamber to another, no one noticed the young woman kneeling quietly near the grand hall staircase. Claire Whitmore lowered her head as she scrubbed a faint crimson stain from the white marble with a damp cloth. The stain refused to disappear. She rubbed harder. Cold water soaked through the sleeves of her plain gray dress until her fingers turned pale from the winter air drifting beneath the enormous entrance doors. She never complained. Complaints belonged to people whose voices mattered. Claire's never had. A pair of embroidered slippers stopped inches from her hand. "You're still here." The sharp voice belonged to Lady Eleanor Hawthorne, mistress of the palace household. She looked down with the same expression one might reserve for dust collecting beneath expensive furniture. "I told you that stair should have been cleaned before sunrise." Claire quickly lowered her gaze even further. "I'm sorry, my lady." "You are always sorry." Lady Eleanor sighed impatiently. "Do try to be invisible tonight." Without waiting for a reply, the older woman turned away, issuing orders to half a dozen servants preparing the grand hall for the evening banquet. Claire remained exactly where she was. Invisible. She had become remarkably good at it. 20 years of living had taught her that disappearing was often safer than being seen. Especially inside royal walls. Especially for an Omega. Her fingers continued moving in slow circles over the marble until the stain finally faded beneath the damp cloth. Only then did she allow herself a quiet breath. She glanced upward for the briefest moment. Above her, towering stained glass windows caught the last light of dusk. Blue, gold, silver. The colors spilled across the floor like frozen moonlight. Beautiful, untouchable. A loud fanfare suddenly echoed through the palace. Trumpets, drums. Then another. Every servant froze. Footsteps stopped. Conversations vanished. Even the flames dancing atop the chandeliers seemed to hesitate. "The noble houses have arrived," someone whispered. Excitement spread through the corridor like sparks racing across dry leaves. Servants hurried toward observation balconies despite repeated warnings to stay focused on their work. Everyone wanted one glimpse of the women who dreamed of becoming queen. Claire quietly gathered her bucket and cloth. There was no reason for her to look. She had no place among beautiful dresses stitched with pearls or necklaces heavy with royal diamonds. Her world existed behind pillars, inside kitchens, between forgotten libraries, and empty hallways no one else wished to walk. She took one final step toward the servant corridor. Then something happened. Far across the palace, beyond layers of carved oak doors, Deep inside the throne chamber where no ordinary servant had permission to enter, a massive pair of iron doors slowly groaned open. The sound rolled through the castle like distant thunder. An old palace guard, whose beard had long since turned white, instinctively lowered his head. His lips barely moved. "Your Majesty." For the first time in 3 years, the Alpha King had left his private chamber. Before we continue, take a second to support the journey. If stories of courage, destiny, and unforgettable love speak to your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more cinematic Alpha King tales. The sound of the great iron doors echoed through every corridor of Blackthorn Citadel. It was not loud. It did not need to be. For the men and women who had served within these walls for decades, that slow metallic groan carried more weight than 1,000 battle horns. Every servant instinctively lowered their eyes. Every knight straightened his posture. Every noble conversation died before another word could be spoken. The Alpha King had emerged. Claire never heard the announcement. She had already disappeared into the narrow servants' passage behind the grand hall, balancing a wooden basket filled with fresh linen across her arms. The corridor smelled of beeswax candles, lavender soap, and old stone chilled by generations of winter. She walked carefully, keeping close to the wall whenever another servant hurried past. Being unnoticed had become second nature. No one had taught her. Life had. She had learned it as a little girl after arriving at the palace orphan quarters with nothing except a faded wool blanket and her mother's silver pendant hidden beneath her dress. That pendant was gone now. Sold years ago to buy medicine for another orphan during a fever outbreak. Claire had never regretted it. Kindness had always cost her something. She simply accepted the price. As she reached the laundry chamber, an elderly woman looked up from folding embroidered tablecloths. "Claire." Mrs. Agnes smiled warmly, one of the few smiles the young Omega ever received. "There you are." Claire returned the smile, gentle but shy. "I finished the grand staircase." "I know." The older woman sighed. "Lady Eleanor has already inspected it twice." Claire nodded quietly. "I must have missed a spot." Mrs. Agnes shook her head. "No, child. It isn't the floor she's looking at." Claire lowered her eyes without asking what the older woman meant. She already knew. Some people searched for mistakes because they expected perfection. Others searched because they simply needed someone beneath them. Lady Eleanor belonged to the second kind. Outside, laughter drifted through the tall windows. The noble daughters had begun arriving in brilliant waves of color. Ruby velvet, emerald silk, ivory satin trimmed with pearls. Servants whispered excitedly whenever another carriage bearing an ancient family crest rolled into the courtyard. "The Ashbournes are here. I heard Lady Vivian is the most beautiful woman in the Eastern Kingdoms. What about Duchess Beaumont's daughter? They say even princes have fought duels over her." Claire continued stacking folded cloths onto polished oak shelves. Beauty had never belonged to her world. At least that was what she believed. Her reflection was something she rarely studied. Soft golden hair escaped from beneath her linen cap. Clear blue eyes. Pale skin touched faintly pink by the winter cold. Delicate features that drew little attention only because she spent every waking hour trying to hide them beneath simple dresses and lowered eyes. She never considered herself beautiful. No one had ever given her reason to. Suddenly, hurried footsteps filled the corridor. A young kitchen maid burst inside, nearly dropping an armful of silver goblets. "He's here." Everyone froze. "The king," Mrs. Agnes whispered. The girl nodded so quickly that loose curls bounced around her face. "I only saw him from the balcony." Her voice dropped into almost fearful awe. "He hasn't changed." "No," another servant quietly corrected. "He has. They say he looks even colder now." Silence settled over the room. Every person inside the palace had heard the stories. King Lucian Ashford, the Wolf King whose silver eyes could silence an army. The ruler who had crushed rebellions before reaching his 30th birthday. The sovereign who had refused every alliance proposed through marriage. 3 years. Not a single royal banquet. Not a single dance. Not one woman had crossed the threshold of his private residence. Some claimed he hated women. Others whispered he despised weakness. The oldest servants simply crossed themselves whenever his name was spoken. Because they remembered. 3 winters ago, the royal physician had carried a young noblewoman from the king's chambers. She had not been bleeding. She had not been wounded. She had simply stared into nothing, trembling as though every joyful memory had vanished from her soul. No one spoke of what happened after that night. No one dared. Claire quietly lifted another stack of folded linens. None of it concerned her. Kings belonged to another universe. Her purpose was simple. Finish today's work. Avoid Lady Eleanor's anger. Return to the tiny room beneath the eastern tower before midnight. That was enough. Or so she believed. Far above the palace, standing alone beside the enormous arched window of the throne chamber, Lucian Ashford watched the snow drift across the royal courtyard. His expression remained unreadable. His black ceremonial cloak hung motionless, despite the wind pouring through the open balcony. Around him stood generals, ministers, and advisors waiting for instructions. No one spoke. The king's silver eyes slowly swept across the hundreds of arriving guests below, as though searching, not for the most beautiful woman in the kingdom, but for someone no one else had even noticed. No one noticed the girl carrying clean linen through the palace corridors. But destiny rarely announced itself with trumpets. It often arrived disguised as someone everyone had learned to ignore. The grand hall transformed as twilight settled over Blackthorn Citadel. Thousands of candles shimmered from crystal chandeliers suspended high above polished marble floors. Their golden light danced across towering pillars carved with wolves, kings, and forgotten victories that stretched back nearly 1,000 years. Every silver plate reflected flickering flames, while musicians quietly tuned violins and harps upon the raised gallery overlooking the feast. The palace had never looked more magnificent, nor more dangerous. Every smile concealed ambition. Every compliment masked calculation. Every elegant bow carried the silent question every noble family had asked themselves for months. Who would become the woman standing beside the Alpha King? The enormous entrance doors opened once again. Another noble family entered. Silk whispered against marble. Jewels caught the candlelight like scattered stars. Young ladies offered graceful smiles while their mothers carefully observed every rival already gathered inside the hall. They laughed softly, praised one another's gowns, admired jeweled necklaces. Yet beneath every pleasant word lurked sharpened claws invisible to ordinary eyes. Claire stepped carefully along the edge of the hall carrying a silver tray stacked with crystal wine glasses. Her plain gray servant's dress blended almost perfectly with the stone walls behind her. Exactly as Lady Eleanor preferred. Invisible servants made fewer mistakes. Or perhaps, invisible servants simply reminded the nobles that some people existed only to serve. Careful. An older footman quietly warned as they crossed paths. The ladies are becoming restless. Claire nodded. I'll stay out of their way. You always do. He smiled kindly before disappearing toward the kitchens. Claire continued moving between long banquet tables, replacing folded napkins and adjusting polished goblets that no guest would ever notice. She enjoyed work like this. Everything had a place. Every task had an ending. Unlike people rarely stayed where they belonged. As she reached the royal dais, she paused. The king's throne stood empty beneath an enormous banner embroidered with a silver wolf standing beneath a full moon. Even without its ruler, the throne seemed intimidating. Cold. Untouchable. Claire quickly lowered her gaze. Servants were forbidden to stare at the royal seat. Especially tonight. Behind her, laughter suddenly erupted. Oh, look. A young noblewoman's voice dripped with amusement. They're letting servant girls work inside the hall now. Claire instinctively stepped aside. 3 elegantly dressed ladies approached, their gowns flowing behind them like rivers of expensive silk. Lady Vivian Ashbourne walked in front. Tall, radiant, perfectly poised. Golden curls framed a face painters would have struggled to improve. She stopped beside Claire. Her blue eyes slowly traveled over the servant's plain clothing before settling on her face. For a brief second, something unreadable crossed her expression. Surprise, then annoyance, I didn't realize palace servants could be so. She tilted her head slightly. Presentable. The women beside her exchanged quiet laughter. Another noblewoman smiled sweetly. What a waste. She would almost pass for a lady if not for those clothes. Vivian's smile never reached her eyes. Fortunately, she lifted a crystal goblet from Claire's tray. Appearances are easily corrected. Her hand tilted. Deep crimson wine spilled across Claire's gray dress, spreading like fresh blood over the faded fabric before dripping onto the marble floor. Gasps echoed nearby. Claire froze. The cold liquid soaked through her sleeves almost instantly. I'm terribly sorry. Vivian's apology sounded flawless. I suppose servants should avoid standing where noble ladies walk. The surrounding women laughed quietly behind jeweled fans. Claire looked down at the spreading stain. It wasn't anger she felt. Only disappointment. Mrs. Agnes had washed this dress only yesterday. She carefully placed the tray upon a nearby table. It's all right, my lady. I'll clean it. Vivian blinked. She had expected tears. Perhaps embarrassment. Instead, the servant simply knelt, removing a folded cloth from her apron before wiping the spilled wine from the polished marble. Without complaint. Without accusation. Without resentment. For reasons she couldn't explain. That irritated Vivian even more. Look, she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. She actually thinks hard work makes people equal. More laughter. One elderly nobleman shook his head. And Omega should remember her station. Another woman whispered. Pretty faces become dangerous when common girls forget who they are. Claire heard every word. Each sentence landed softly against her heart like snowflakes falling onto frozen ground. Cold. Familiar. Expected. She continued cleaning. The marble gradually returned to its spotless shine. As she rose to her feet, Lady Eleanor appeared from across the hall, her face tightening the instant she saw the stained servant's dress. Claire Whitmore. Her sharp voice sliced through the conversation. What have you done now? Claire opened her mouth. But before she could answer, every trumpet inside the palace sounded at once. Long, deep, powerful. The musicians immediately fell silent. Hundreds of conversations vanished. Every noble turned toward the towering doors behind the royal dais. The royal guard struck their spears against the marble floor in perfect unison. Once, twice, 3 times. Then the master of ceremonies lifted his staff. His voice rolled across the grand hall like distant thunder. His Majesty, the Alpha King. The room had witnessed kings crowned, traitors condemned, and wars declared. Yet nothing inside Blackthorn Citadel had ever become as silent as the moment King Lucian Ashford crossed the threshold. The towering oak doors swung inward without haste. Cold winter air followed him into the grand hall, extinguishing several candle flames nearest the entrance before the fire steadied once more. Every nobleman lowered his head. Every knight struck a clenched fist against his chest. Even the musicians remained frozen, their hands suspended above silent strings. No one dared move before the Alpha King did. Lucian walked with the calm certainty of a man who had never questioned whether the ground beneath him belonged to him. His ceremonial cloak, woven from black wolf fur, flowed behind broad shoulders that had carried kingdoms through famine and war. Silver embroidery traced ancient runes across the heavy fabric, catching the candlelight with every measured step. He wore no crown. He never needed one. Power surrounded him like an invisible storm. His silver eyes remained fixed ahead. Cold. Unreadable. Entirely detached from the admiration surrounding him. The noble daughters who had spent months preparing for this evening instinctively straightened their posture. Lady Vivian Ashbourne lowered her lashes just enough to appear graceful. Lady Rosalind Beaumont adjusted a loose curl beside her cheek. Another young noble subtly loosened the ribbon around her neckline, hoping beauty alone might draw the king's attention. One by one, they smiled, curtsied, waited. Lucian acknowledged none of them. Not a glance. Not a pause. Nothing. His footsteps echoed across the marble until he reached the royal dais. Only then did he turn. His gaze swept across the grand hall. Not lingering. not searching for beauty. Instead, his expression resembled a commander studying a battlefield long before the first sword was drawn. The silence became heavier. Ministers standing beside the throne exchanged nervous glances. Lord Cedric Hawthorne leaned slightly toward the High Chancellor. "He seems disappointed." The Chancellor answered without moving his lips. "His Majesty has attended many ceremonies, but never this one." Across the hall, Claire remained standing exactly where Lady Eleanor had left her. Her dress was still damp with spilled wine. Tiny crimson stains clung stubbornly to the worn fabric despite her efforts to clean it. She wished only to disappear before Lady Eleanor assigned another punishment. Keeping her head lowered, she carefully picked up the empty silver tray. One step, then another. She intended to slip quietly behind one of the enormous stone pillars leading back toward the servants' corridor. That was when Lady Eleanor's sharp voice stopped her. "Claire." The young Omega immediately halted. "Yes, my lady. Clean the floor properly." Claire blinked. "It is already clean." Lady Eleanor glanced toward the faint drops of wine, still glistening near one chair leg. "I said properly." Several nearby nobles looked over with mild amusement. Claire quietly knelt once more. The polished marble felt cold beneath her knees. She unfolded the same damp cloth and began wiping away stains no guest would ever notice. Behind delicate fans, whispers floated through the gathering. "Poor thing. They always choose the prettiest servants. So they remember they're still servants." Another woman chuckled softly. "I almost mistook her for one of the ladies." The laughter spread politely. Measured. Civilized. Cruel. Claire focused only on the floor beneath her hands. She counted each slow breath. 1, 2, 3. Mrs. Agnes had once told her that storms eventually passed if one refused to become the wind. So Claire remained still. She neither defended herself nor cried. She simply worked. High above the hall, enormous stained glass windows reflected the moonlight now shining through gathering clouds outside. Blue, silver, white. Their colors spilled across the marble in shifting patterns until one narrow beam settled unexpectedly beside Claire. The pale light illuminated her face as she lifted her head for only a heartbeat to move another wine goblet from the floor. Golden strands escaped beneath her servant's cap. Her blue eyes caught the moonlight. Soft, clear, unaware. At that exact moment, Lucian's gaze reached the far side of the hall. He had already overlooked dozens of jeweled gowns, ignored every practiced smile, dismissed every calculated introduction. Then, without warning, his eyes stopped. Not on Lady Vivian. Not on the daughters of dukes or ancient alphas. Not on the women who had crossed kingdoms hoping to become queen. They settled upon a servant kneeling quietly beside a wine stain. His breathing almost imperceptibly slowed. For 3 years, every face had been the same. Empty, distant, untouchable. Yet something about the young Omega beneath the moonlight stirred a feeling he had believed the curse had buried forever. No pain, no burning, no darkness clawing through his mind. Only silence. A strange, peaceful silence. Behind him, the royal physician noticed the king's sudden stillness. His face lost all color. Impossible. He had seen that expression only once before. 3 years earlier. On the night everything changed. Sometimes, destiny does not arrive with a declaration. Sometimes, it begins with a single heartbeat that refuses to obey the past. The silence lingering inside the grand hall grew almost unbearable. King Lucian Ashford remained perfectly still atop the royal dais. No one understood why. His ministers waited. The royal guard stood frozen like carved statues. The noble daughters kept their elegant smiles fixed upon their faces despite the growing uncertainty. They all believed the king was studying them, choosing, judging, perhaps deciding which noble house would one day stand beside the throne. None of them realized. He was looking far beyond them, far beyond jeweled crowns and embroidered gowns. His silver eyes remained locked upon the young servant kneeling beside a polished marble floor. Claire carefully folded the damp cloth in her trembling hands. She could still feel dozens of eyes resting upon her after Lady Eleanor's scolding, and she wished nothing more than to disappear behind the nearest pillar. She never raised her head high enough to notice the king's gaze. Not once. She simply stood, picked up the silver tray, and turned toward the servants' corridor. One quiet step, then another. The hem of her worn gray dress brushed softly across the marble. Lucian watched every movement. His breathing remained calm, steady, but something inside him had begun to shift. 3 years. 3 endless winters trapped inside a body that had betrayed him. He remembered every failed attempt, every political alliance that demanded a royal engagement, every terrified noblewoman who had reached for his hand. The instant their skin touched his, the curse awakened. Fire beneath his flesh, darkness tearing through his veins, voices whispering from somewhere beyond memory. Sometimes he had collapsed before the entire court. Sometimes the women themselves had fainted under the weight of whatever ancient force guarded the curse. Eventually, he stopped trying. He stopped attending celebrations, stopped accepting visitors, stopped believing freedom still existed. Isolation had become easier than hope. Yet now, watching one quiet Omega servant walk away, his wolf remained completely still. No rage, no pain, no violent warning clawing through his chest. Only an unfamiliar calm that spread through him like the first warmth after an endless winter. The royal physician noticed first. Dr. Elias Rowan had spent years studying every symptom of the king's mysterious affliction. He knew every change in Lucian's breathing, every tightening muscle, every flicker of pain across those unreadable silver eyes. Tonight, there was none. His fingers tightened around the leather-bound medical journal tucked beneath one arm. Impossible. The curse should already be reacting. The servant had entered the king's awareness. Every previous episode began long before physical contact. Yet His Majesty looked peaceful. Lucian finally spoke. His voice was low, quiet enough that only those nearest the throne heard him. Elias. The physician immediately stepped forward. Your Majesty. The girl. Dr. Rowan followed the king's line of sight. His eyes landed upon Claire's retreating figure. The servant. Lucian gave the smallest nod. Who is she? I don't know, Your Majesty. Find out. The physician bowed. Immediately. Before he could move, Lord Cedric Hawthorne approached with careful confidence. Sire, the daughters of the Eastern houses await your greeting. Lucian never looked at him. They can wait. The minister hesitated. They have traveled for weeks. They will continue waiting. No one dared argue further. Across the hall, Claire reached the edge of the servants' entrance. Relief slowly filled her chest. Just a few more steps. She would leave the grand hall behind. She would change into a dry dress. Perhaps Mrs. Agnes would save her a piece of fresh bread after the banquet ended. Tomorrow would be another ordinary day. Another quiet sunrise. Another collection of invisible tasks. She almost smiled at the comforting thought. Then a young page rushed toward Lady Eleanor, nearly slipping across the polished floor. My lady. What is it? The boy leaned close enough to whisper. Lady Eleanor's eyes widened. What? She looked toward the throne, then toward Claire, then back again. Her face lost every trace of color. Around the hall, several ministers noticed the sudden change. Dr. Rowan himself had already begun walking through the gathered nobles, his expression unusually grave. The conversations resumed in cautious whispers. What's happening? Why is the royal physician leaving the dais? Has something happened to the king? No one had the answer. Claire heard hurried footsteps approaching behind her. She turned slowly. Dr. Rowan stopped only a few feet away. He studied her face for several long seconds, as though confirming something he could scarcely believe. His voice remained respectful, almost careful. Mississippi. Claire blinked. No royal physician had ever addressed her before. Why, yes, sir. He drew one slow breath, then spoke the words that instantly silenced every conversation inside the grand hall. His Majesty, the Alpha King, wishes to see you. The entire kingdom had dreamed of hearing the Alpha King choose a queen. No one imagined his first choice would be a servant girl still wearing another woman's spilled wine. For one endless heartbeat, Claire believed she had misunderstood. The royal physician stood before her with the quiet dignity of a man whose words were never questioned. His Majesty wishes to see you. The sentence echoed through her mind, refusing to become real. Me? The words slipped from her lips almost as a whisper. Dr. Elias Rowan inclined his head. Yes. I think there has been a mistake. There has not. His calm voice carried no uncertainty. The king specifically asked for you. Around them, silence shattered into 1,000 hushed conversations. The grand hall, moments earlier as still as winter ice, suddenly came alive with whispers flowing from one noble to another like ripples across a frozen lake. The servant. Did he say the servant? Impossible. Lady Vivian Ashbourne's smile disappeared. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her crystal goblet until her knuckles turned pale. She watched Claire with open disbelief. Of every woman gathered tonight, the king had noticed her? Lady Rosalind leaned toward Vivian. This must be about the wine. Vivian forced herself to nod. Of course. She embarrassed the ceremony. He probably intends to punish her. The explanation sounded reasonable. Comforting. Several nearby nobles eagerly accepted it. Naturally. No Alpha King would summon an unknown Omega for any other reason. I almost pitied her for a moment. Their confidence returned. Soft laughter quietly resurfaced. Claire wished they were right. Punishment. At least punishment made sense. Nothing else did. Lady Eleanor hurried across the marble floor, her face pale beneath carefully applied powder. She stopped beside Claire and offered the royal physician a respectful bow. Dr. Rowan, I apologize if this servant has caused trouble. Claire immediately lowered her head. I'm sorry, my lady. Lady Eleanor shot her a warning glance before turning back toward the physician. I'll have her removed immediately. No. Dr. Rowan's answer came gently, but firmly. She is not leaving. The king requested her presence. No one spoke. Lady Eleanor stared at him, unable to hide her confusion. You mean, the throne? Rowan finished quietly. She is to approach His Majesty. Even the servants standing near the banquet tables stopped breathing. Claire's heart pounded painfully against her ribs. Approach. The king? Servants were forbidden from coming within several yards of the royal dais unless directly commanded during formal ceremonies. She had never imagined receiving such an order. Not in dreams. Not even as a child. She swallowed. I don't know the proper protocol. You'll bow. The physician replied kindly. And answer only if His Majesty speaks. Claire nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Mrs. Agnes appeared from the edge of the servants' corridor, her worried eyes immediately finding Claire among the gathering crowd. Their gazes met for only a second. The older woman offered the smallest reassuring smile. It wasn't confidence. It was encouragement. The kind a mother might give before watching her daughter walk into an uncertain future. Claire drew one careful breath. Then another. Her trembling fingers smoothed the wrinkles from her damp gray dress. The crimson stain remained. No amount of rubbing had removed it. She suddenly became painfully aware of how out of place she looked. Every noblewoman wore diamonds. She wore faded linen. Their gowns shimmered beneath candlelight. Her sleeves were still wet from spilled wine. They carried themselves like queens. She looked exactly what she had always been. A forgotten Omega servant. Dr. Rowan noticed the hesitation in her eyes. You don't need to be afraid. Claire managed a faint smile. I've never stood before a king. No, the physician quietly admitted. But neither has anyone stood before this king, quite like you. His words puzzled her. Before she could ask what he meant, the royal guards struck their spears against the marble once more. The path leading to the throne slowly opened. Rows of nobles stepped aside. Silk brushed against silk. Jewels sparkled beneath hundreds of candles. Every eye inside the grand hall followed one person. Not the Alpha King. Not the powerful ministers. Not the noble daughters who had crossed kingdoms hoping to become Luna. A servant girl. Claire Whitmore. She lowered her gaze, gathered every ounce of courage she possessed, and began walking. Each footstep echoed louder than the last. The distance to the throne seemed impossibly long. She passed Lady Vivian, who watched in silent disbelief. She passed ministers who exchanged uneasy glances. She passed knights whose expressions revealed more curiosity than suspicion. Above them all, seated upon the ancient throne carved from black stone, Lucian Ashford never looked away. The closer she came, the calmer the storm inside him became. For the first time in 3 years, the curse was silent. And for the first time in 3 years, the Alpha King found himself waiting. Not for a battle, not for a prophecy, but for one quiet Omega to stand within reach. Every pair of eyes in the grand hall followed the servant girl. Some watched with curiosity, others with contempt. But only one man watched her as though the fate of an entire kingdom depended on the next few steps she would take. Claire walked slowly across the polished marble, careful not to stumble despite the countless eyes fixed upon her. The hall felt larger than ever. Each heartbeat echoed louder than the musicians who had long since fallen silent. She kept her gaze lowered, exactly as palace etiquette demanded. Never look directly at the king unless commanded. Never speak unless spoken to. Never forget your place. Those rules had been repeated so often throughout her life that they no longer felt like lessons. They felt like breathing. The silver tray had already been taken from her hands, leaving her fingers strangely empty. She clasped them together in front of her trembling dress. The crimson wine stain still marked the faded gray fabric. It seemed impossible that she would stand before the most powerful alpha in the kingdom dressed like this. Behind her, whispers followed every step. Look at her. She isn't even wearing court colors. Does she really think she belongs there? Lady Vivian's voice drifted softly through the gathering. She won't be standing for long. Another noblewoman nodded. The king will make an example of her. Several men quietly agreed. Royal dignity must be protected. No servant approaches the throne without consequence. Their confidence returned once again. Punishment was familiar. Mercy was not. Claire reached the foot of the wide stone staircase leading toward the royal dais. 20 broad steps separated common ground from the throne itself. Royal guards stood motionless along both sides, their silver armor reflecting hundreds of candle flames. None of them moved. Yet their presence alone reminded every guest that only the king's will mattered here. Dr. Rowan stopped beside the staircase. You may continue. Claire looked upward. For the first time, she truly saw him. King Lucian Ashford sat upon the ancient black throne carved centuries before his birth. He appeared even taller seated than most men standing. His dark ceremonial cloak flowed over the edges of the throne like midnight spilling across stone. Silver embroidery shimmered beneath the candlelight. His expression remained unreadable, neither welcoming nor hostile. His silver eyes rested quietly upon her. They were unlike any eyes Claire had ever seen. Not cold, not warm, simply heavy, as though they carried years no one else could understand. She lowered herself into a respectful curtsy. My king. Her voice barely carried beyond the first row of nobles. Lucian did not answer immediately. He simply watched her. Every instinct sharpened inside him. His wolf listened, waited, expected pain, expected darkness, expected the familiar agony that had ruled every human interaction for 3 unbearable years. Nothing came, only stillness. The silence became almost uncomfortable. Lord Cedric finally stepped forward. Your Majesty, shall the ceremony continue? Lucian ignored him. Instead, he spoke directly to Claire. What is your name? The question stunned the court. Kings did not ask servants for their names. Servants were introduced by others. Claire swallowed carefully. Claire Whitmore, Your Majesty. Her voice remained soft. I serve in the palace household. Lucian repeated the name almost inaudibly. Claire, as though testing how it sounded. Then, he stood. The movement alone caused dozens of nobles to instinctively bow once more. Even the guards tightened their grip on their spears. Lucian descended the first step. Then another. Each measured footfall echoed across the hall. Dr. Rowan's pulse quickened. No, he whispered beneath his breath. Not this close. Not yet. 3 years of careful isolation had taught them exactly what happened whenever the king approached a woman. His body rejected contact. Sometimes violently. Sometimes catastrophically. The physician instinctively moved forward. Sire. Lucian raised one hand without looking back. A silent command. Stop. Rowan obeyed immediately. The king continued walking. One step. Another. Until only a few feet separated him from Claire. She could sense his presence now. Not through fear. Through something impossible to explain. The air itself felt different. Warmer. She kept her head lowered, unaware that every noble in the hall had stopped breathing. Lady Vivian's smile finally disappeared completely. This is madness, she whispered. The High Chancellor looked toward Dr. Rowan. Should we intervene? The physician never took his eyes off the king. If the curse awakens. His voice broke slightly. There may be nothing any of us can do. Lucian stood directly before Claire. Close enough to see tiny droplets of melted snow still clinging to loose strands of her golden hair. Close enough to notice the faint redness on her hands from scrubbing frozen marble. Close enough to smell lavender soap beneath the scent of spilled wine. His wolf remained perfectly calm. Not a trace of pain. Not a whisper of darkness. For the first time in 3 years, the impossible seemed within reach. Slowly, almost cautiously, the Alpha King began lifting his hand toward the frightened Omega standing before him. The king's hand had brought death on battlefields and justice to kingdoms. Tonight, it stopped only inches away from the cheek of a frightened Omega, and an entire court forgot how to breathe. Claire remained perfectly still. She did not dare lift her eyes. She could sense him standing before her, close enough that the faint scent of cedarwood and winter air surrounded her like an invisible cloak. No one had ever stood this near to the Alpha King by choice. Not for 3 years. Her heart beat so loudly she feared everyone in the hall could hear it. She tightened her fingers against the fabric of her dress, praying she would not disgrace herself by trembling. Lucian's hand remained suspended in the air. Only a few inches. So close, yet separated by 3 years of fear. His silver eyes never left Claire's face. The curse had taught him caution. Hope had become a dangerous thing. Too many times he had believed the pain might be gone. Too many times the darkness had returned with greater cruelty. He remembered noble women collapsing in terror. He remembered his own screams echoing through empty chambers after every failed attempt. He remembered ordering every mirror removed from his private residence because he could no longer bear the man staring back at him. His wolf growled softly inside him. Not in warning. In anticipation. It was waiting. Watching. Curious. Dr. Rowan felt cold sweat gather beneath his collar. Every instinct urged him to stop this. To order the guards forward. To protect his king from another collapse. Yet, he remained frozen. Something inside him whispered that history itself had paused to witness this moment. Lord Cedric stepped closer to the physician. If His Majesty touches her. Rowan answered without looking away. We'll know. The minister swallowed. And if the curse returns? The physician's silence was answer enough. Claire slowly lifted her eyes. Only a little. Enough to see the king's gloved hand hovering before her. Then, she saw his face. There was no anger, no disgust, no arrogance. Only an exhaustion so deep it almost hurt to witness. For one impossible moment, she forgot she was standing before a king. She simply saw a lonely man. Without thinking, she spoke. Very quietly. Your Majesty. Lucian's eyes met hers completely for the first time. They say you're not afraid of anything. Claire hesitated, then continued. But, you look tired. The words escaped before she could stop them. A gasp swept through the grand hall. Lady Eleanor nearly collapsed. She's finished. Someone whispered. How dare she? No servant had ever spoken to the Alpha King with such simple honesty. Not because the words were disrespectful. Because they were personal. Lucian did not react. He simply continued looking into Claire's blue eyes. No one had asked how he felt in years. They asked about treaties, wars, harvests, borders. Never him. The silence stretching between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt strangely peaceful. Claire immediately lowered her head again. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. You were truthful. Lucian's deep voice interrupted gently. Another wave of astonishment spread through the hall. The king was not angry. Claire blinked. I didn't mean to offend you. You didn't. Lucian slowly removed one black leather glove. The sound of soft leather sliding across his hand echoed unnaturally loudly inside the silent chamber. Dr. Rowan's face turned completely white. No, he whispered. The king's bare hand emerged. Strong, scarred, marked by countless battles. Several faint silver veins shimmered beneath his skin before disappearing again. Everyone in the palace knew what came next. Whenever uncovered skin approached another woman, the curse awakened. Lucian studied his own hand for a brief moment. 3 years. He had almost forgotten what hope looked like. Then, without another word, he reached forward. Very slowly, as though approaching a frightened bird that might fly away. Claire instinctively held her breath. She did not retreat. She did not move. She simply stood where she was, trusting the man before her despite understanding nothing. 1 inch remained. Then less. The distance disappeared. His fingertips brushed gently against her cheek. The entire world seemed to stop. Dr. Rowan waited for the scream. The guards braced themselves. Lady Vivian closed her eyes. Every noble expected the familiar nightmare to begin. But no scream came. No violent burst of power shattered the hall. No darkness swallowed the king. Instead, Lucian felt something he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. Warmth. Simple. Human. His fingertips rested lightly against Claire's skin. Nothing burned. Nothing broke. His breathing remained steady. The curse did not answer. Slowly, almost disbelieving what he was feeling, Lucian closed his eyes for the briefest moment. When they opened again, for the first time in 3 years, the Alpha King smiled. It was only the faintest curve of his lips, barely visible, yet powerful enough to leave an entire kingdom staring at him in absolute disbelief. A kingdom can survive war, famine, and betrayal. But sometimes, a single smile is enough to change history forever. No one moved. No one spoke. The grand hall, moments ago filled with whispers and calculated ambition, had become as silent as the ancient mountains surrounding Blackthorn Citadel. King Lucian Ashford was still touching Claire's cheek. His bare hand remained against her skin. Warm. Steady. Unaffected. 3 years of fear dissolved in a single impossible moment. Claire barely breathed. She could feel the roughness of old battle scars beneath his fingertips, yet his touch was unexpectedly gentle, as though he feared she might disappear if he pressed too firmly. She looked into his silver eyes. The loneliness she had glimpsed only moments before was still there. But now, something else stood beside it. Hope. Small. Fragile. Almost forgotten. Lucian slowly lowered his hand. His fingers lingered for the briefest heartbeat before falling to his side. He searched his own body for the familiar agony. The burning beneath his skin. The crushing darkness that usually followed every attempt at human contact. Nothing. His heartbeat remained calm. His breathing never changed. For the first time since the curse had stolen 3 years of his life, he felt completely free. Dr. Elias Rowan took one uncertain step forward. His voice trembled despite decades of service. Your Majesty? Lucian turned toward him. There was no pain in his face. No strain. Only quiet certainty. It is gone. Those 3 words echoed across the hall more powerfully than any royal decree. Dr. Rowan stared in disbelief. Gone. The pain. Lucian answered simply. It never came. The physician covered his mouth with one trembling hand. His eyes filled with tears before he could stop them. He had devoted 3 years to searching for a cure that every scholar declared impossible. Every failed remedy. Every sleepless night. Every desperate experiment. None of them had accomplished what one quiet servant had achieved simply by existing. Several royal guards exchanged stunned glances. One elderly knight lowered his head, whispering a prayer beneath his breath. Even the High Chancellor looked as though the world had shifted beneath his feet. Lady Vivian refused to believe what she had witnessed. No. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. This isn't possible. She looked toward Claire with growing disbelief. A servant. An Omega. A woman wearing a stained gray dress. How could she accomplish what the daughters of kings and dukes never could? Around the hall, the whispers returned. But now they carried fear instead of mockery. Did you see it? The curse. It never awakened. Who is that girl? How can this happen? Claire heard none of them. She remained standing exactly where she was, uncertain whether she should bow again or quietly leave before someone explained this terrible misunderstanding. My king, she said softly. I don't understand. Lucian looked at her for a long moment. Neither did he. Yet one truth stood undeniable between them. When she was near, the darkness vanished. He slowly turned toward the assembled court. Hundreds of nobles immediately lowered their heads. His voice filled the enormous chamber without effort. Claire Whitmore. She instinctively straightened. Yes, Your Majesty. You asked me a question. She blinked in confusion. I did. You said. A faint smile returned to his lips. That I looked tired. Several ministers exchanged bewildered glances. Of every sentence spoken tonight, the king remembered those words. Claire's cheeks warmed with embarrassment. I'm sorry. I spoke without thinking. No, Lucian answered quietly. You spoke without fear. Another silence settled over the grand hall. Different this time. Not tense. Not uncertain. Respectful. The Alpha King slowly unclasped the silver wolf brooch, fastening his ceremonial cloak across one shoulder. A collective gasp spread through the nobles. The brooch was no ordinary ornament. It bore the royal crest, the living symbol of the Ashford bloodline. No one except the king was permitted to wear it. Without hesitation, Lucian stepped closer to Claire once more. He fastened the silver wolf upon the collar of her simple gray dress. Against faded linen, the royal emblem gleamed brighter than any diamond inside the palace. When he stepped back, his voice carried through every corner of Blackthorn Citadel. From this moment forward, no one in this kingdom will treat Claire Whitmore as invisible again. His silver eyes swept slowly across every noble family gathered before him. If anyone insults her, the warmth vanished from his expression. The Alpha King returned. Cold. Absolute. They insult their king. No one dared object. No one dared breathe too loudly. Because every soul inside the grand hall understood the same terrifying truth. The servant girl they had mocked only moments before had just become the only woman in the kingdom whom the Alpha King could touch. And somewhere, hidden beneath centuries of forgotten secrets, the true reason why had only begun to awaken.